Under the neon hush of the city, Jonas Morell had long ago learned to breathe in silence as though it were his only companion. His days had shrunk into ritual, his nights stretched into lonely corridors of thought. He lived in a place where the world above still glimmered with drone lights and glass bridges, yet down below everything felt hollow, like an abandoned cathedral where echoes returned emptier than before. He had grown accustomed to this emptiness, convinced himself that he needed nothing more than stillness, order, and the sterile rhythm of duty. His apartment, with its pale walls and folded towels, was less a home than a shell where he could keep his memories quiet. But life has a way of intruding on the carefully built fortresses of the heart, and love, even the kind that enters barefoot and trembling, does not ask for permission. It began with a knock, small, uncertain, yet strong enough to reach through the walls Jonas had built inside himself. He almost ignored it, the way he had ignored countless other calls for connection. But that night, for reasons he could not explain, he opened the door. There she was, drenched in rain, wrapped in translucent scraps of plastic, her dark hair tangled like forgotten ribbons, her green skin dulled with grime, yet glowing faintly with specks of hidden light. Her eyes were pale, slit-pupilled, otherworldly, and yet they carried something achingly human, fear, pride, and the fragile hope that someone might not turn her away. She whispered in a broken accent, "Please, I only have 3 credits. Let me use your shower." In that instant, something stirred in Jonas, something he thought long dead. He had seen desperation before, in fires and wreckage, in bodies he once tried to save. But this was different. This was not a cry for rescue, it was a plea for dignity. He stepped aside, and with that simple gesture, the silence of his life cracked. The stranger entered, and with her, the possibility of change. The hiss of running water filled the apartment, a sound Jonas had not realized he missed. It was not merely the cleansing of her skin, but the cleansing of the air between them. He waited with measured breaths, hands braced on the counter, listening to the steam rise and curl through the narrow halls. When she stepped out, wrapped in a towel, clean once more, Jonas felt the room shift. She seemed taller now, steadier, her luminous specks glowing like stars beneath the surface of her skin. She accepted the clothes he offered, ate the meal he set before her with quiet gratitude, and told him her name. Arena. A fragile word, yet anchored, like a seed waiting for soil. There was no declaration of love, no sudden spark that novels often insist upon. Instead, it was the silence they shared that carried weight, the way her eyes traced the edges of his room, the way she touched the towel rack with precise care, the way his heart, once dulled by monotony, quickened in her presence. For the first time in years, his apartment no longer felt like a tomb. The air was alive. The silence was warm. Arena slept on the couch that night, her breathing slow and steady, her body curled beneath the blanket, as though bracing against a world that had given her nothing. Jonas sat at his console, monitors dark, but he did not work. He watched the reflection of her sleeping form in the glass. Not for threat, not for suspicion, but because the quiet felt different. For years, silence had been his shield. Now it was shared, and in that sharing there was a kind of healing. Morning came soft and blue. Jonas woke to the rhythm of the dome lights shifting, the faint hum of the system reboot. He rose carefully, already cataloguing details out of habit: the temperature, the vent cycle, the faint smell of soap lingering in the air. Irina still slept. One foot slipped from the blanket, her long black hair half dry and tangled across her arm. She looked smaller like this, yet not fragile, more like someone recovering after a long siege. He brewed tea, set out ration bread, and wondered at the strangeness of caring about another's comfort. It was a question he had not asked in years. Would she wake hungry? Would she trust enough to drink what he offered? When she stirred, blinking against the pale light, her first words were simple. "You stayed?" "Yes," Jonas replied quietly. "You didn't lock me in." "No." It was a small exchange, almost trivial, but beneath it pulsed the fragile roots of trust. He watched her hands tremble as she held the mug of tea, saw the way she scanned the room even as she sipped, always searching for exits, always calculating survival. And in that moment he realized that trust is not given in grand gestures. It is built in the quiet, healing details of mornings shared. She told him, slowly, that no one was looking for her, that she had been forgotten by the city's records years ago, cast aside, uncounted, unacknowledged. He listened without judgment, the way he once listened to the broken voices of those trapped under collapsed beams. And when she asked why he had let her in, he gave the only answer he knew: because no one else would. Something softened in her eyes then, a fleeting shimmer of belief. It vanished quickly, hidden behind the armor of survival. But Jonas felt it, and it lingered within him like the aftertaste of hope. He placed a comb and a toothbrush on the table, small tokens, mundane objects, yet to her they seemed as rare as jewels. She touched them carefully, as though they might shatter. "You didn't ask what I'll pay you," she murmured. "I don't want payment," Jonas said. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious, but beneath it was the glimmer of something aching to heal. The days that followed unfolded not in drama, but in gestures. Irina cleaned his counters, folded his spare shirt neatly, learned to move through his apartment as if it were her own. Jonas, in turn, found himself cooking meals with more care, setting towels where she could see them, brushing her hair with deliberate patience. These were not the acts of strangers. They were the rhythms of people quietly weaving themselves into each other's lives. And in the weaving, something began to mend. There were moments of fear, of course. The inspectors came, their scan wands humming through the small space. Jonas's heart held steady as he declared her his guest, his partner. Irina played the role flawlessly, sitting at the table with calm shoulders, scrolling the datapad as though she had always belonged. When they left, when the door sealed shut, she trembled only once. And Jonas caught her when she whispered, incredulous, "They believed it." "They saw what I told them to see," he said, though what he truly meant was, "I chose for them to believe in you." That night she pressed her forehead to his chest, just once, brief and silent. But in that touch lay more healing than any words could give. It was the first moment she allowed herself to be seen not as a fugitive, not as a shadow, but as someone who could matter. Love, when it came, did not announce itself with fire. It arrived like the slow warmth of sunlight through a cracked window. It was in the way Irina set her toothbrush beside his, the way Jonas checked the water usage logs not out of paranoia, but because he cared if she could stay. It was in the laughter that escaped one evening when he spilled crumbs on her knee and she flicked them back at him. It was in the way silence, once heavy and cold, turned into a soft blanket they both could rest beneath. They did not speak of forever. They did not need to. The healing lay not in promises of tomorrow, but in the simple truth of now, that in a city built on forgetting, they had chosen to remember each other. Jonas no longer lived in a tomb of quiet. Irina no longer drifted unseen. Together, they found that love does not need grandeur. It needs only presence, patience, and the courage to stay. And so, in the stillness of Sector 19, beneath the artificial dome light, two souls who had once been strangers began to write a story not of survival alone, but of tenderness, an unlikely romance that healed by simply being shared. Jonas had always believed that mornings were meant to be endured, not savoured. They arrived like cold commands, telling him to wake, to work, to repeat the rituals that kept him hidden in plain sight. But after Irina came into his life, morning softened. The sharp hum of the ventilation system, once an indifferent alarm, became the prelude to a quiet symphony, the faint rustle of fabric as she stirred beneath a blanket, the soft cadence of her breathing as she shifted from dream to waking, the almost imperceptible way her presence expanded the air around him. It was healing, though he never used the word aloud. He watched her in the pale dome light, her braid loose and wild across the pillow, her skin glowing faintly with bioluminescent flecks that pulsed like tiny embers. Her fingers curled against the sheet, relaxed in a way that told him she trusted the walls of this apartment more than the streets beyond. Trust was something Jonas had stopped believing in long ago, yet here it was, fragile and alive, resting quietly in his home. Irina sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes, still sharp even when softened by sleep, scanned the room as though to remind herself she was safe. When she met his gaze, there was no fear, only quiet recognition. "You stayed," she whispered. "I did," Jonas replied. "Then maybe I can stay too." Those words echoed in him long after they were spoken. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was the closest thing to one he had ever heard from her. And with that small declaration, their days began to change. They cooked together, their elbows brushing as they leaned over narrow counters. She moved with precision, slicing roots and vegetables with steady hands, while he worked beside her, stirring pots with a focus that surprised him. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full, like soil quietly nourishing seeds. Irina began to hum under her breath while washing dishes, melodies low and unfamiliar, carrying the cadence of a language Jonas did not know. He listened without interrupting, feeling the way the tunes seeped into the walls, softening the edges of his world. Little by little her presence marked the apartment, a comb left by the sink, a towel folded next to his, a mug she always used, held in both hands as though warming herself from the inside. These were small things, yet to Jonas they felt monumental. For years, his home had been a museum of survival, clean, ordered, lifeless. Now it was becoming something else. A place where two lives touched, overlapped, began to heal each other in ways neither of them dared to name. One evening, as the dome dimmed into artificial dusk, Irina stood by the window. The city lights glowed blue beyond the glass, lines of drones tracing paths like frozen constellations. Jonas approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her solitude. Yet she spoke without turning. "If they ask who I am, what will you say?" "My partner," Jonas answered without hesitation. She turned then, her eyes wide, searching his face for signs of pretense. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice almost too soft to hear. "Yes," he said simply, "both for them and for me." Her shoulders eased, tension melting like frost under sunlight. For a moment, the healing was visible. Her posture no longer braced, her gaze no longer guarded. She nodded once, and in that gesture lay 1,000 unspoken truths. When the inspectors came days later, Irina played her part flawlessly. She sat at the table, scrolling a datapad with casual ease, her legs crossed, her expression calm. The inspectors barely glanced at her before recording their notes. To them, she was no anomaly, no threat, simply a resident's partner. When the door sealed behind them, Irina exhaled sharply, setting the datapad down with trembling hands. Jonas crossed the room, and without thinking, she leaned into him. Her forehead pressed against his chest, her breath warm against his shirt. "You could have told them I was nothing," she whispered. "You're not nothing," Jonas replied. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She had spent years invisible, a ghost in the city's underbelly, but here was a man who refused to let her vanish. The healing power of those words sank deep, rooting themselves in places she had long believed barren. The intimacy between them grew slowly, like dawn stretching across the horizon. They brushed their teeth side by side, their reflections caught together in the mirror. They folded laundry together, her careful hands smoothing fabric as though each crease mattered. They ate in silence, yet their knees touched under the table, a small point of warmth that neither pulled away from. Love crept into their lives, not with thunder, but with the steady rhythm of shared routines. One night, Jonas offered her the bed. Irina tilted her head, studying him. "Only if you sleep too," she said firmly. And so, for the first time in years, he lay beside another person. The bed felt smaller, yet more alive. He woke to the warmth of her body pressed gently against his, her breath steady, her hand resting unconsciously on his ribs. For a long while, he stayed still, afraid to move, afraid the fragile miracle would vanish. But she did not pull away. She belonged there, and he realized he wanted her to. Days blended into weeks, and the apartment transformed. Irina no longer moved like a guest. She hummed while she worked, left her belongings scattered in quiet corners, filled the rooms with her presence. Jonas stopped checking the locks every few hours. He found himself watching her instead, fascinated by the way her eyes softened when she looked out the window, the way her laughter, rare but real, brightened the air like light through stained glass. One morning, as she sipped tea with both hands wrapped around the mug, she whispered, "Do I get to be something else now?" Jonas walked to her, set his hands gently at her waist, and looked into her pale green eyes. "You already are," he said, and then he kissed her, slow, unhurried, certain. It was not the desperate passion of strangers clinging to survival, but the healing touch of two souls who had stopped running from silence. They filled it instead with each other. That evening they cooked together on the floor, laughing softly when he spilled crumbs and she flicked them back. Later they undressed without shame, sliding beneath the same blanket as though it had always been theirs. The apartment was no longer cold or sterile. It was warm, lived in, a place where healing love had taken root. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, vents cycling, drones gliding, lights pulsing, but inside, the world had changed. Irina began to hum again as she brushed her hair, melodies low and haunting. Jonas listened, heart steady, realizing that for the first time in years he did not dread tomorrow, because tomorrow meant waking beside her. Tomorrow meant hearing her voice, seeing her reflection in the glass, feeling the healing weight of her presence. And in that quiet certainty, he knew, the silence that once suffocated him had been transformed. It was no longer emptiness. It was love, breathing softly, alive between them. Jonas had never realized how much of his life was measured by absence until Irina began filling the empty spaces. For years he had lived in precision, folded shirts, spotless counters, chairs aligned with quiet symmetry. His world had been a machine, each part predictable, safe, controlled. But with Irina, disorder arrived in gentle ways. A brush left on the table, a towel hung slightly askew, a faint hum of melody that drifted through the rooms like morning light. These small disturbances, once things he would have corrected, became threads of warmth weaving themselves into the fabric of his days. The silence he had once protected so fiercely no longer seemed like survival. It seemed like a cage he was slowly stepping out of, guided by her presence. There was a morning when Jonas woke not to the sound of the dome lights cycling on, but to her laughter. Soft, hesitant at first, then blooming into something fuller, like the sound of water moving over stones. She was in the kitchen, her hair loose down her back, trying to balance 2 mugs of tea while humming a tune he did not know. She nearly spilled, caught herself, and laughed again. Jonas watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, letting the sound soak into him. It was a kind of healing he hadn't believed possible, that laughter could live in this apartment, that joy could sit at his table. Irina noticed him then, her eyes catching his. "You watch too much," she teased, though her voice was gentle. "I've learned to," he answered. "Watching isn't living." "Maybe," Jonas said. "But watching you feels closer to living than anything else I've done in years." She looked away quickly, embarrassed, though the faint glow along her collarbones pulsed brighter, betraying her emotion. Jonas stepped closer, took one of the mugs from her hands, and their fingers brushed. Neither moved away. It was a small touch, ordinary by any measure, yet it sent a current through him that felt both grounding and electric. The days unfolded like this, ordinary moments imbued with quiet intimacy. They cooked together, their movements gradually sinking as though rehearsed by some unseen rhythm. Irina cleaned the vents, her sleeves rolled up, humming softly, while Jonas watched from the ladder, steadying her when she reached too far. In the evenings they sat by the window, sharing silence while the city lights pulsed like distant stars. Sometimes she asked questions about his past, about the places he had been, the lives he had once tried to save. He answered slowly, choosing words like stepping stones across a river. She listened, not with pity, but with the stillness of someone who understood the weight of carrying wounds alone. One evening, as the dome dimmed into amber dusk, she asked him quietly, "Why did you stop?" Jonas looked at her, at the sharp clarity of her eyes softened by curiosity. "Because saving bodies isn't the same as saving lives," he said. Irina tilted her head, considering this. "But you stayed when others left. That means something." Her words struck deeper than she knew. For years, Jonas had carried his past like a scar, proof of failure. Yet in her voice, it sounded less like defeat and more like devotion. Healing sometimes came not in answers, but in being seen differently. That night, they shared the bed again, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Jonas lay on his side, watching the faint glow of her skin in the dim light. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his chest, fingers splayed as though anchoring herself to his heartbeat. "You're warm," she murmured. "So are you," Jonas replied. "Not always," she whispered. "But here, with you, I feel it." He covered her hand with his own, pressing it gently against him. In that stillness, surrounded by nothing but their breath, Jonas realized that love was not something sudden. It was a steady unfolding, like petals opening at dawn, like walls slowly lowering one brick at a time. The following days carried a rhythm almost like ritual. Irina began to braid her hair in the mornings, often seated on the edge of the bed while Jonas laced his boots. He found himself drawn to the quiet intimacy of the act, the way her fingers moved with precision, the way strands slipped and shone in the pale light. Once, without asking, he took the brush from her hands and began combing her hair himself. She froze at first, unused to being cared for in such a way, but then relaxed, closing her eyes as he worked through the tangles with deliberate gentleness. It was a small act, yet for both of them it carried the weight of trust. "Careful," she whispered. "I know how to be," Jonas said. "You treat me like I'm fragile." "No," he corrected softly. "I treat you like you matter." She opened her eyes then, watching him through the mirror's reflection, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not dramatic, not a confession, but a recognition that they had become each other's anchor in a world built on uncertainty. Even the city seemed to conspire in their closeness. The inspectors came once more, but Jonas had prepared everything: fake logs, adjusted water usage, neatly staged belongings that made Irina's presence undeniable. She played her role calmly, sipping tea at the table, her posture relaxed as though she had always lived there. The inspectors barely lingered before leaving, and when the door sealed shut, Irina turned to Jonas with eyes shining, not from fear, but from relief. She stepped close, pressed her forehead against his, and whispered, "This place is mine too." Jonas did not correct her. He only wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though she had always been there. Healing often hides in the smallest affirmations: a toothbrush by the sink, a voice declaring belonging, an embrace that makes no demands. Love deepened in ways neither of them planned. It wasn't only in the stolen touches or the nights spent tangled in sheets. It was in the way Irina began to hum as she cooked, the way Jonas started brewing coffee strong enough for two, the way their steps matched when they walked the corridor together. The apartment, once sterile and silent, had become a sanctuary, a home. One morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the dome, Irina stood barefoot by the window, the slate shirt hanging loosely on her frame, her hair unbraided and wild. Jonas stood behind her, watching the glow of her skin in the soft light. She didn't turn, but she smiled faintly and said, "You're staring again." "I know," he admitted. "Do you like it?" "More than you'll ever know." She leaned her forehead against the glass, her reflection mingling with the city's glow. "I want to be clean," she murmured, "not just outside. All the way." Jonas stepped forward, resting his hand gently at her waist. "Then let me help." He led her to the bathroom, filling the tub with warm water. Steam curled around them, rising like a veil. Irina stepped in slowly, her body glowing faintly beneath the surface, her breath deep and steady. Jonas knelt beside her, cloth in hand, and began washing her with careful strokes. She watched him silently, her eyes unblinking, her lips parting in soft exhales. When he hesitated, she whispered, "Stop being careful." The words unlocked something in him. He dropped the cloth, cupped her jaw, and kissed her deeply. Water splashed over the edges of the tub as she pulled him close, their bodies pressed together, the air thick with steam and urgency. For the first time, there was no distance, no hesitation, only the truth of their need for each other. Later, when the water had gone still and the steam thinned to nothing, Jonas carried her to the bed. They lay wrapped in the blanket, damp and breathless, their hearts beating in unison. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Healing had moved from silence into touch, from fear into closeness. The days that followed were gentler, steadier. Irina no longer flinched at every sound in the corridor. Jonas no longer checked the locks with restless paranoia. Instead, they shared mornings over coffee, evenings over stew, nights over whispers and warmth. They were not just surviving, they were living, quietly and tenderly, in defiance of a world that had tried to erase them. And for Jonas, who once believed silence was the only thing he could trust, there was now a new truth. Silence could heal, but only when it was filled with the breath of someone you loved. Jonas had always prepared himself for the possibility of disruption. It was the way he survived, by imagining every threat before it arrived, rehearsing responses until they became instinct. But after weeks of Irina's presence, after mornings spent listening to her hum and evenings watching her reflection in the glass, his vigilance softened. He still noticed the hum of the corridor vents, still registered the faint static of the surveillance nodes, but they no longer consumed him. His focus shifted unconsciously toward the warmth of her laughter, the weight of her body leaning against his, the simple healing rhythm of life shared. He did not realize how much this mattered until the knock came. It was not like the first knock, the hesitant plea of a stranger seeking a shower. This one was firm, deliberate, official. Jonas felt the vibration travel through the metal of the doorframe into his chest. Irina froze where she stood, a towel in her hands, her hair half braided. Her eyes flashed with the same fear he had seen on their first night. Jonas met her gaze and shook his head slightly. "Stay calm," he whispered. "It may be nothing." But he knew better. He moved to the terminal, fingers sliding across the screen, checking logs. A variant sweep had been flagged again. Too soon, too precise. Someone had noticed patterns he had worked carefully to hide. He breathed slowly, forcing his pulse into steady rhythm. "We're ready," he told her, more to calm her than because he believed it. Arena nodded, though her hands trembled. The inspectors entered, their grey suits sharp against the pale walls. Jonas stepped aside, greeting them with the practiced calm of a man who had nothing to hide. Arena sat at the table, as they had rehearsed, a data pad in her hands, her shoulders relaxed. She looked ordinary. She looked like she belonged. Jonas watched the inspector's eyes flick across the room. One lingered a heartbeat too long on Arena, then moved on. They scanned the vents, checked the restrictors, logged the water usage. Their tools beeped, whirred, fell silent. After a brief nod, they turned to leave. "Clear," one said. When the door sealed shut, Arena let out a sharp breath and pressed both hands to the table. Jonas placed his hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "They saw what I wanted them to see," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes to him, wide with disbelief. "You didn't tell them I was nothing." "You're not nothing," Jonas repeated, steady. Arena stood slowly, her breath unsteady. She stepped close until she was only inches from him. "Then this place is mine too," she whispered. He cupped her face gently, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "It always was," he said. And with that, the tension broke. She pressed her forehead to his chest, breathing him in. Healing, Jonas realized, did not always arrive in stillness. Sometimes it came in surviving storms together. In the days that followed, the apartment grew warmer. Arena moved with more ease, no longer glancing at the door with every sound. She hummed louder, laughed more freely. Jonas caught himself smiling when she teased him about his meticulous habits. "You plan everything," she said once, tilting her head. "Even me?" Jonas paused, then answered, "No, you weren't planned, but I don't want you gone." She blinked, stunned, then turned back to the window with a slow nod. It was not a promise, but it was enough. Their love deepened in these quiet admissions. At night they lay side by side, her braid undone, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Jonas found himself tracing patterns on her skin, following the faint bioluminescent specks that pulsed like constellations. She would close her eyes and sigh softly, the sound of healing in breath. "You make me feel alive," she whispered once. He kissed her temple, replying, "You are alive, and you're not alone." But the city had a way of intruding. Weeks later, another variance report flickered across Jonas's terminal, small, almost insignificant, but enough to remind him that their peace was fragile. He weighed the options carefully. To stay hidden was to risk eventual exposure. To step forward meant claiming Arena openly, registering her existence in the system. She stood beside him as he explained, her eyes steady. "If they know I exist, they could take it away," she said. Jonas met her gaze. "If they know you exist, they can't erase you again." The decision was not easy, but it was necessary. One morning, they walked together down the corridor to the registration console. Arena wore his slate shirt tucked neatly into the drawcord pants, her ceremonial thread tied smooth at her waist. She looked not like a fugitive, but like someone returning home. Jonas unlocked the panel, typed in 2 names, and slid a thin plastic tag into the row beside his own. Jonas Morell, Arena. She stared at the tag for a long moment, silent. Then she pressed her thumb to it until it clicked into place. The sound was small, yet final. Her lips parted, her voice quiet but steady. "That's my name." Jonas stood close behind her, his warmth steady at her back. "It is," he said. When they returned to the apartment, Arena hung her towel beside his without hesitation. She set her comb neatly on the shelf, moved through the space with a new steadiness. Jonas watched her from the doorway, his chest full. She turned to him and asked softly, "Do I get to be something else now?" He walked to her, set his hands at her waist, and pulled her close. "You already are," he whispered. The kiss that followed was not rushed. It was healing, deliberate, unhurried. The culmination of every quiet act of trust, every morning of shared tea, every night of silence filled with breath. They held each other like survivors who had finally stopped running. That night they cooked together on the floor, laughing when Jonas spilled crumbs and Arena flicked them back at him. They washed the dishes side by side, their shoulders brushing. Later they undressed without hesitation, sliding beneath the blanket as though it had always belonged to both of them. The silence that once suffocated Jonas was now a warm blanket itself, wrapping them in belonging. In the days that followed, Arena's belongings spread quietly through the apartment. Her towel, her comb, her clothes folded in drawers. She hummed while she worked, her melodies turning the sterile air into something softer. Jonas stopped checking the locks. He realized with a kind of quiet astonishment that it had been days since he felt the weight of fear pressing against his ribs. Healing, he thought, sometimes looked like this: the absence of dread, the presence of love. One morning, Arena stood barefoot by the window, her hair loose, her green skin glowing faintly in the dome's light. Jonas came up behind her, set his hand gently at her waist. She leaned back into him, whispering, "You're staring again." "I know," he said. "Do you like it?" "Yes," he answered simply. "I like this one." She smiled faintly, turning to rest her forehead against his chest. "Then maybe I can stay like this." Jonas wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Stay," he said softly. "This place is ours now." And in that embrace, in that silence full of breath and warmth, Jonas understood something he had never dared to before. Love was not an interruption. It was a home. The city above moved in its relentless rhythm, drones tracing blue rivers of light, lifts gliding with sterile precision, vents exhaling their endless sighs. Yet inside the apartment, time flowed differently. It no longer felt like survival measured by cycles of light and dark. It felt like life, soft, healing, steady. Jonas would wake each morning to the warmth of Arena curled against him, her breath even, her hair spilling across his chest like a dark river. He would listen, not to alarms or variance logs, but to the simple truth of her presence. And in that quiet, he discovered a kind of freedom he had thought forever lost. Arena, too, transformed. The girl who had once knocked on his door, trembling and wrapped in rags, now moved through the space with confidence, her steps unhurried, her laughter fuller. She hummed while she cooked, leaving melodies in the air like threads of light. She braided her hair with patience, sometimes letting Jonas brush it loose first, savoring the way his hands moved with careful tenderness. She cleaned, not out of fear of being caught, but out of joy at belonging. Each act was small, yet it carried the weight of healing. It was the quiet declaration of someone who had finally been seen, finally been named. Together, they built a rhythm that no inspector, no system could erase. Mornings over tea, evenings at the window, nights filled with warmth and breath. The apartment changed with them. Towels hung side by side, mugs paired on the counter, shirts folded in drawers that no longer belonged to one person alone. Silence was no longer emptiness. It was fullness, saturated with love. There were moments when fear tried to creep back in, an unexpected sound in the corridor, a flicker on the terminal screen. But instead of hiding, Irina reached for Jonas's hand. Instead of retreating, Jonas stepped forward with her. They had learned that safety did not come from walls or systems. It came from each other. Healing was not the absence of fear, it was the choice to face it together. One evening, as the dome dimmed to indigo, Irina stood barefoot at the window. The glow of her skin shimmered softly, like starlight caught beneath the surface. Jonas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him, her voice a whisper. "Do you ever think about the first night?" "Every day," Jonas replied. "I was so sure you would turn me away." "I almost did," he admitted. "But you didn't." "No," Jonas said, tightening his hold. "Because you knocked, and because I didn't want silence anymore." Irina turned then, her pale green eyes catching his. "And now?" she asked. "Now," Jonas said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "I want you. Not silence, not emptiness. You." She kissed him softly, slow and unhurried. It was not the desperate kiss of survival, but the healing kiss of belonging. Their lips lingered, their breaths mingling, their hearts steady. Jonas felt her hands slide into his, fingers intertwining like roots growing together in the same soil. That night they cooked stew on the floor again, laughing when he spilled crumbs and she flicked them back at him. Later they washed dishes side by side, their shoulders brushing with every movement. When they finally lay down, tangled beneath the blanket, Jonas whispered, "You are my home." Irina pressed her forehead to his chest, her voice steady. "And you are mine." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The city outside never changed, but their world did. Irina began singing as she worked. Low, strange songs that spoke of places Jonas had never seen. He listened, eyes closed, letting the sound heal the pieces of him that had long gone numb. Sometimes she would catch him watching and tease him. "You stare too much." He would only smile and reply, "Because you're worth watching." It was not a love marked by grand gestures. It was a love marked by presence, by every shared meal, every brush of fingers, every morning when Jonas woke to her warmth. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. And in that quietness lay their greatest healing. One morning, Irina stood before the mirror, combing her hair. She caught his reflection watching her and smiled faintly. "Do I get to be something else now?" she asked. Jonas walked to her, set his hands at her waist, and kissed the crown of her head. "You already are," he whispered. The mirror reflected them together. Two souls who had once been strangers, now bound by something greater than survival. Jonas realized then that love was not an interruption to life. It was the life he had been waiting for all along. And so, in the stillness of Sector 19, beneath the artificial dome, Jonas and Irina wrote a story not of emptiness, but of fullness, not of fear, but of healing, not of silence, but of love. The apartment, once a tomb of order, had become a sanctuary of belonging, and within its walls, two voices, two breaths, two lives beat as one. If you have felt even a fragment of this warmth while reading their story, let it remind you: love heals, love transforms, love makes a home where there was once only silence. And if this story touched your heart, if it gave you even a moment of comfort or a spark of hope, please share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like and subscribe. Your voice, your presence is what keeps these stories alive. Together, we can keep building places of healing, word by word, heart by heart,